A reading from Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 7 through 8. Blessed are those who trust in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. They shall be like a tree planted by water, sending out its roots by the stream. It shall not fear when heat comes, and its leaves shall stay green. In the year of drought it is not anxious, and it does not cease to bear fruit.
On February 7th, 1984, at 7:25 a.m. Houston time, Captain Bruce McCandless decided to go for a little walk. Strapped to a jetpack aboard Space Shuttle Challenger at 170 miles above the Atlantic, McCandless was about to make history. He would become the first person to ever undertake an untethered spacewalk. Down on Earth, reporters hoped the spectacle of an untethered spacewalk would match the theatrics of the famous moonwalk of 1969. But the astronauts aboard Challenger experienced a series of humiliating failures once they were in orbit. The primary goal of their 9-day mission was the deployment of 2 communications satellites. The spacewalk was to come much later in the mission. But after the crew deployed the first satellite, Mission Control lost it in space. "We can't find it," they told the astronauts over the radio. The following day, the crew deployed the second satellite, and Mission Control lost contact with it too. The bill of those 2 lost satellites exceeded $180 million. Anxieties grew even higher when, after an onboard experiment failed miserably, the shuttle's toilet, which had always been troublesome, stopped working altogether. Nothing was going according to plan. But 5 days into the mission, even after all these mishaps, McCandless remained undeterred. From an altitude of 90,000 feet above the Earth, moving through space at 18,000 miles an hour, he fired the thrusters of his jetpack, rose slowly from Challenger's cargo bay, and flew clear of the shuttle. He was now floating in space, untethered, completely free, alone. McCandless worked the joysticks with his fingertips. His jetpack trembled and shuddered as its onboard computers adjusted his course with tiny whispers of gas from its nitrogen jets. As he drifted slowly backward, he watched the gulf separating him from the shuttle grow ever wider. He looked for stars but saw only an enveloping darkness. His teeth began to chatter as the temperature inside his spacesuit plummeted. With his eyes fixed on the shuttle, McCandless glided through space until finally reaching his destination, some 320 feet away from Challenger. He sailed back toward Challenger and then glided away once more, playfully dipping and rising and turning somersaults along the way. For over 6 hours, McCandless floated freely through space like a human satellite at 23 times the speed of sound, completely untethered, as Earth quietly twirled beneath his feet. McCandless, who later lived here near Conifer, Colorado, was 47 years old when he took his historic untethered spacewalk, and the original plan had called for him to turn away from the shuttle once he reached his destination, to face out into the dark void with his back to the shuttle. But not once did McCandless turn his back on Challenger. It was his only chance of returning home. It's a breathtaking story of a true American hero, of course, but it's also a powerful, poignant metaphor for how at any given moment in our lives we can find ourselves untethered, drifting in the empty void of this world, separated from our divine source, the only source in the universe that can preserve our life. We test the limits of our human freedom and push the boundaries of our independence all the time. And sometimes we can feel that gulf of separation grow even wider. We lose contact with the source and have to face the emptiness of life alone. Perhaps the metaphor speaks to our often tenuous relationship with God. From the very beginning, our nature as humans has always been to wonder how far we can drift off without losing contact with God. How far is too far to drift before our connection with God is severed and we can't get back? It's the timeless existential dilemma we all face as humans. The fear of nothingness and the thrill of defying it. The insatiable longing for independence and the utter dread of being all alone. The hubris of believing we can drift still a little further from the source, and the fear of losing contact and never getting back. It's then that we start to feel like Elton John's Rocket Man, burning out his fuse up here alone, untethered, separated, uprooted, unrooted, unable to find our way back to the source. It's the human story. And it's detailed time and again throughout the Bible, perhaps most vividly in the book of Jeremiah. The book of Jeremiah is a mournful and militant book, full of tears and rage, sorrow and judgment, which is why we moderns often ignore it. Its words are pointed, its message is harsh. God is really, really ticked off. And things aren't going to end well. Jeremiah is known as the prophet of wrath, which makes him decidedly unpopular in his day. Jeremiah is the son of a priest from Anathoth, a small town just outside of Jerusalem. He rails against the unbridled abuses of the kings and priests of Judah during the 7th century BCE. He announces that Judah is unfaithful, that it's put its trust in its armies, its corrupt politicians, its wealth, its borders, its unimpeachable religious and political institutions. Jeremiah calls out Judah for worshiping pagan gods, for trampling the poor, for baptizing oppression and injustice, all under the pretense of religion and purity and righteousness. Jeremiah never signed up to be a prophet. He has simply here been chosen by God to expose Judah's transgressions. And he's heartbroken for his country's sin and for the consequences that will come upon Judah. He foretells the penalties: famine, plunder, defeat, exile, captivity. And Jeremiah pays a heavy price for being the messenger of bad news. His friends and family abandon him. The royal court imprisons him. The people of Judah condemn him. His words fall on deaf ears. Nothing changes. It's business as usual in Judah. Until it finally happens. The Babylonians attack and conquer Judah. Jerusalem falls and the temple is destroyed and countless perish. Some survivors are carted off into exile in Babylon. Others are left behind to live this miserable, mournful existence. And Jeremiah announces that the people had it coming all along. Most of us don't like prophets because they seem to have only two real sermons: repent or else, or I told you so. But what Jeremiah is really trying to tell Judah is that it's not too late, that it doesn't have to end like this, that there is still time to repair that severed connection to the source. Jeremiah is like an early warning system for his culture. His mission is not to condemn anyone, but simply to show how this connection between Judah and the source had been broken, and how the people were drifting dangerously close to the dark void from which they might never return. Judah had turned its back on the source. drifting untethered, defying the ways of God, defying righteousness and mercy and justice. Judah, said Jeremiah, will become, quote, like a desert shrub, living in the parched places of the wilderness in a barren land where no one survives. He was talking, of course, about Babylon, exile in the wilderness. But Jeremiah says it doesn't have to happen this way. There's still time to trust not your mighty enemies or your fallen rulers or your fleeting wealth, but to trust in God. He says you can choose instead here to be like, quote, trees planted by the streams, whose roots reach down to the waters, who won't be stressed in the time of drought or fail to bear fruit. Judah, he says, has a choice. Return to the source and live like a tree planted by a stream, or drift further from the source and die like a withering shrub in the wilderness. It sounds pretty fire and brimstone-y for most of us moderns. But what if we hear it today as a wake-up call in these unprecedented, chaotic times that we're living through? How many of us are feeling parched like a desert shrub these days, severed or splintered from the source, struggling to stay connected to God, to trust that God is in this with us? The world is not as it should be, and it can be hard to see goodness, to be kind and generous. It's easier to despair as the evening news wears us down and the chaos of our government drains us of our energy and attention, and the spin and subterfuge, the half-truths and untruths that dominate our national dialogue, our media feeds, our personal connections and conversations, how they deplete our trust and our empathy, our inner reserves. A cultural malaise eats at us today, robbing us of agency, eroding our hope, and we tie our happiness to mere mortals. We make flesh our strength. Geopolitical events, the next election, a presidential tweet, the closing bell on Wall Street, the balance in our 401ks, the latest breaking news, it all makes very hard. It makes it very hard to live fully in the present, to stay rooted in God, to remain connected to the source, and to be generous and just and kind. So maybe the words of the prophet Jeremiah are timely. Woe, he says, woe to those who trust in mere mortals and make mere flesh their strength. They shall be like a shrub in the desert. But blessed are those who trust in the Lord. They shall be like a tree planted by water. Jeremiah isn't suggesting that we should not worry about the problems of the world or simply entrust our earthly concerns to God. The issues he railed against, oppression, injustice, hypocrisy, abuse of power, spiritual and political corruption, these all mattered so deeply to him that he said Judah's very future depended on whether his people fixed these problems or allowed them to go unchecked. But more than this, what Jeremiah is really trying to say is that we simply cannot fix them, no matter how hard we try, if we are untethered from the source, if we are not rooted in God. We will wither and we will grow weary and thirsty, unable to bear fruit, anxious in this drought like a desert shrub. And today our roots and our connection to the source is being tested like never before. What will we do? In this age of political upheaval and partisan intransigence, will we surrender to the politics of outrage and grievance and demonizing? And will we wither then like a desert shrub or like a tree planted by the stream? Will our roots draw from the source of love and moral courage? In this age of growing wealth disparity, where the social safety net that protects our poor and our aged and our most vulnerable children as it grows ever more frayed and fragile? Will we surrender to the prevailing winds of scarcity and greed and acquisitiveness, like a desert shrub dying of thirst? Or will we live like a tree planted by the stream, where our roots can reach deep enough to find the waters of abundance and generosity? In this age when so many of our institutions, political and religious, are crumbling from abuse of power, from self-interest, from neglect and self-aggrandizement, will we surrender to the prevailing winds of nostalgia, a nostalgia that pines for the past, or to the winds of resignation that sees no hope for a future? Or will we, like a tree planted by the stream, will we draw from the waters of life that birth new possibilities and more fruitful realities? It all depends upon our connection to the source, says Jeremiah, and to the connections that we foster among us. In The Hidden Life of Trees, Peter Wolleben writes about stumbling across this patch of strange-looking mossy stones and a preserve of old beech trees that grows in the forest near his home. He passed these stones many times before without paying attention at all to them, but that day he stopped and bent down to take a look. They were an unusual shape, gently curved with hollowed-out areas. Carefully, he lifted the moss on one of the stones, and what he found underneath was tree bark. These, it turned out, were not stones at all, but old wood. He was surprised at the hardness of the wood, because it usually takes only a few years for beech wood to decompose in wet conditions. But what surprised him was that he couldn't lift the wood. It was attached to the ground in some way. He took out his pocket knife and carefully scraped away some of the bark until he got down to a greenish layer. Green? This color is found only in chlorophyll, which makes new leaves green. Reserves of chlorophyll are also stored in the trunks of living trees, which could mean only one thing here. This old piece of wood was still alive. He then noticed that the remaining stones were arranged in a circle with a diameter of about 5 feet. What Wolleben had stumbled upon were the gnarled remains of an enormous ancient tree stump. And all that was left were vestiges of the outermost edge. The interior had completely rotted into humus long ago, evidence that the tree must have been felled at least 400 or 500 years earlier. How could the remains have clung on to life for so long? This stump, it turned out, was getting assistance from neighboring trees, specifically from their roots. The surrounding beech trees were pumping sugar to the stump to keep it alive. Trees, it turns out, are social beings. They share food with their own species, sometimes even with their competitors. The reasons are the same as for human communities. There are advantages to working together. On its own, a tree is at the mercy of wind and weather and drought, but together, many trees create an ecosystem that moderates extremes of heat and cold and stores and shares water. In the protection of a grove, trees can endure storms and injuries, disease. They can live to be very old. Healthy trees send nutrients to sick or injured trees. Every tree makes some contribution to the community, has some value to the whole, has some role in keeping the grove alive and healthy. It's an image right off the pages of Jeremiah, with his call to not go it alone, to stay connected to the source. The world is full of shallow-rooted spirituality, quick fixes, motivational mantras, faith that flourishes in fair weather but withers at the first sign of heat. This isn't what Jeremiah describes. This isn't what sustains us. Deep roots take time. They grow in the dark, in the unseen places, through patient, persistent practice. They grow through seasons of showing up even when we don't feel like it. They grow through choosing connection over comfort, through vulnerability over self-protection, through trust over control. They grow in community. And here's the promise. The tree planted by the stream, it never fails to bear fruit. Not because it's special, not because it's more talented or even more deserving, but simply because it stays connected. It draws from a source that never runs dry. The deeper we sink our roots into God, the freer we become. Free from the tyranny of circumstance, free from the anxiety of self-sufficiency, free to bear fruit even when everything around us suggests we might wither. Jeremiah calls us to be a deeply rooted people in a shallow rooted world, to sink our roots so deep that when the storms come, and they will come, we'll bend and not break. Like McCandless drifting in the dark void, we will discover that we are never truly untethered, but instead held and rooted and at home. Our takeaways for today: deep roots sustain us through inevitable droughts. The deeper we sink our roots, the freer we become. The fruitful life is the deeply rooted life.